The air on the tarmac at Westchester County Airport was sharp with the smell of jet fuel and the coming of a bitter November rain. It was the kind of damp, bone-aching cold that made old men complain about their joints, and the wealthy wonder why they hadn't left for Palm Beach a week earlier. That's far enough. This is a restricted area. The voice was clipped, authoritative, and drenched in the kind of condescending boredom that only years of dealing with the public can produce. Eleanor Vance stopped, her worn leather work boots scuffing on the painted yellow line. She looked up at the man standing beneath the wing of the gleaming Gulfstream G700. He was tall, silver-haired, with a ramrod posture that spoke of a military past. The 4 gold stripes on his epaulets glittered, even in the flat grey light. Captain Alistair Finch. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the smudges of charcoal on her jeans and the fraying cuff of her canvas work jacket. He saw a problem. A stray. If he had looked closer, past the dusty clothes and the weary expression of a 24-year-old who had just spent 72 sleepless hours finalizing the most ambitious architectural project of her generation, he might have seen something else. He might have noticed the quiet, unshakable confidence in her stance, or the intelligent, assessing quality in her deep brown eyes as she took in the lines of the aircraft. His aircraft. He might have seen the woman whose name was on the deed of title for the very machine he was so arrogantly guarding. He didn't know that the girl he was about to dismiss wasn't just a passenger. She was the new owner of the entire charter fleet. And by the time the first drop of icy rain began to fall, Captain Finch's meticulously constructed world was already beginning to fracture. This is the story of a flight that was nearly grounded by prejudice and the karmic turbulence that followed. Eleanor, or Ellie as her grandmother called her, pulled the collar of her jacket tighter. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across her face. She had just come from the construction site in upstate New York, a revolutionary new museum designed to blend seamlessly into the granite cliffs overlooking the Hudson River. It was her baby, the first major project she had spearheaded since inheriting Vance and Sterling architecture from her legendary grandfather, Arthur Vance. For 3 days, she had survived on coffee, adrenaline, and the sheer joy of seeing her vision rise from the earth. Then the call had come. Her grandmother, Clara, had suffered a massive stroke in Charleston. The doctors were using words like critical and unpredictable. Every commercial flight out of the New York area was either cancelled or delayed for hours due to the storm front rolling in. But the G700, tail number N91AV for Arthur Vance, could climb above the weather. It was the crown jewel of the small exclusive charter company her grandfather had acquired as a passion project in his later years. Ellie hadn't even had time to go home and change. She'd thrown her drafting tools into the back of the site foreman's pickup truck, grabbed the heavy portfolio containing the final presentation sketches for Clara's new sunroom, a surprise she'd been planning, and had him drop her at the private aviation terminal. "I'm here for the flight to Charleston," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion and the cold knot of fear in her stomach. 901 Alpha Victor. Captain Finch's lips thinned into a smirk. It was a subtle expression, but it conveyed a universe of disdain. "I'm sure you are. The staff entrance is around the back by the catering trucks. If you're here to clean the cabin, you're late." Ellie took a slow breath, reminding herself that her grandmother was waiting. Arguing with this man was a waste of precious time. "You misunderstand. I am the passenger." Finch let out a short, sharp laugh that was carried away by the wind. "The passenger? Of course. And I'm the King of Siam. Listen, little girl, I don't know what you're playing at, but this is a multi-million-dollar aircraft. My client, a Mr. Vance, is due any minute. He's not going to be pleased to find a vagrant loitering on his plane. Now turn around before I have airport security escort you out." He was using Mr. Vance as a shield, assuming the owner was her grandfather, a man who had passed away 6 months ago. The company's new COO, Marcus Thorne, was supposed to have updated all the crews on the change of ownership. Clearly the memo hadn't reached Captain Finch, or he had chosen to ignore it. "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said, her voice dropping, losing its tired edge, and gaining a core of steel. "Arthur Vance was my grandfather. This aircraft, and the company that operates it, now belong to me. We have a flight plan filed for Charleston International. I'd like to board now." The captain's amusement curdled into something colder, more aggressive. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. He was a good foot taller than her, a physically imposing man who was used to using his size to intimidate. "Don't you dare use that man's name," he hissed, his face hardening. "I flew Mr. Vance for 15 years. He was a gentleman of taste and decorum. He would never, ever associate with someone who looks like you." He gestured dismissively at her entire being, from her messy bun to her dusty boots. "I don't know how you got past the gate, but your little charade is over. Get off my tarmac." The first drop of rain hit Ellie's cheek. It felt like a tear. In her arms, she clutched the heavy leather portfolio. It contained the meticulously hand-drawn plans for a glass-walled room she had designed for her grandmother's house, a place where Clara could sit and watch the egrets in the marsh, even when she was too frail to walk outside. It was a gift of love, the last thing she had to show her. "Captain," she said, her patience finally snapping, "I am tired, I am worried, and I am the person who signs your paychecks. You will lower the stairs and let me on my plane." For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed Finch's face, but it was quickly extinguished by the fire of his own certainty. He had spent his life in a world of rules, hierarchies, and appearances. This girl, with dirt under her fingernails and a defiant look in her eye, simply did not compute. She was a glitch in his perfectly ordered universe. "That's it," he snarled. He reached out, not to grab her arm, but to shove the portfolio she was holding. "I told you to leave." The shove was harder than he intended. The portfolio flew from her grasp. The leather clasp burst open, and a sheaf of large, beautiful architectural drawings spilled out, scattering across the wet asphalt. The wind caught them immediately, sending them skittering across the ground like frightened birds. One of the main elevation drawings, a masterpiece of ink and watercolor, landed face down in a growing puddle of iridescent jet fuel and rainwater. Ellie froze. She stared at the ruined drawing, the ink already starting to bleed, the dream of her grandmother's sunroom dissolving into a grimy swirl. A cold, quiet rage, unlike anything she had ever felt, settled over her. It was the same feeling she got when she saw a beautiful old building being demolished for a parking lot. It was the desecration of something carefully and lovingly made. She slowly raised her eyes to meet his. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." Inside the cockpit, First Officer Ben Carter, a young pilot barely a year older than Ellie, watched the scene with growing horror. He had seen Finch be difficult before, berating fuelers for being too slow or complaining about the brand of coffee the caterers provided. But this was different. He saw the captain shove the girl, he saw the papers fly. He had the passenger manifest on his knee. It read, "Vance Eleanor, Principal." He knew. "Captain," Ben said into the cockpit intercom, his voice trembling slightly. "The manifest says, 'Stay out of this, Carter,'" Finch barked back without turning around. He was on a roll now, high on his own authority. He pulled out his company radio. "Westchester Ops, this is Gulfstream 700. I have an unauthorized individual on the ramp at stand 9. Refusing to comply, requesting security dispatch, immediately." He gave Ellie a triumphant sneer. "There, in 5 minutes you'll be explaining yourself to the police. Maybe a night in a holding cell will teach you some respect." Ellie didn't flinch. She simply reached into the deep pocket of her jacket and pulled out her phone. The screen glowed against the darkening sky. She ignored the dozens of missed calls and texts from her office and scrolled to a single number in her contacts. "Calling your mommy to come pick you up?" Finch taunted. "Tell her to bring bail money." She pressed the call button and switched it to speaker. The phone rang once. A man's voice answered, sounding harried and stressed. "Thorne. Marcus, it's Ellie Vance." Captain Finch's sneer froze on his face. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, mottled grey. He knew that voice. It was Marcus Thorne, the formidable chief operating officer of Apex Air Charter, the man who reported directly to the owner, the man who could end a pilot's career with a single email. "Ellie, thank God," Thorne's voice crackled through the speaker. "I've been trying to reach you. I heard about Clara. I'm so sorry. The G700 is fueled and ready for you. The crew should be—" He trailed off. "Is everything all right? You sound strange." Ellie's eyes never left Finch's terrified face. I'm standing on the tarmac in front of my plane, Marcus, and I'm having a bit of trouble boarding. Trouble? What kind of trouble? A mechanical issue? No, Ellie said, her voice as cold and clear as the rain that was now starting to fall in earnest. The issue is with your captain, a Mr. Finch. He seems to believe I'm a vagrant. He has refused me entry, destroyed a set of my personal architectural plans, and has just called airport security to have me arrested. There was a dead silence on the line. It stretched for an eternity, thick with unspoken fury. The only sound was the drumming of the rain on the fuselage. When Thorne spoke again, his voice was a low, dangerous growl. He did what? He's standing right here, Ellie continued calmly, watching Finch's mouth open and close like a landed fish. Perhaps you'd like to clarify the chain of command for him. Put him on the phone, Thorne commanded. The two words were like chips of ice. Ellie held the phone out to the captain. It's for you. Finch's hands were shaking. He looked at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. He looked at the young woman in the dusty jacket, and finally saw her. He saw the Vance jawline, the same intelligent eyes as the old man he had so admired. He saw the power she wielded, not with expensive clothes, but with a quiet, unyielding will. The reality of his colossal miscalculation crashed down on him with the force of a hard landing. He took the phone. Mr. Thorne, sir. Finch. The roar that erupted from the small speaker was so violent that Finch physically recoiled. You listen to me, you pompous, arrogant fool. The woman you are standing in front of is Eleanor Vance. She owns the jet you're standing on. She owns the uniform on your back. She owns me. You were given a directive 3 months ago that all authority on N91AV defers to her. Did you not read it? I thought it was a formality, sir. She didn't look. I don't pay you to look. I pay you to fly and to follow orders, Thorne bellowed. Now, you will pick up every single one of those papers. You will get down on your hands and knees and clean them if you have to. You will apologize to Miss Vance like your life depends on it. Because it does. And if her plane is not in the air in the next 10 minutes, I will personally fly to Westchester, strip those stripes off your shoulders, and make sure the only thing you're qualified to pilot for the rest of your life is a goddamn riding lawnmower. Do you understand me? Yes, sir, Finch whispered, his face ashen. The line went dead. He lowered the phone, his hand trembling. He looked at the scattered drawings, now soaked and stained, lying in the puddles on the tarmac. He looked at Ellie, whose expression was unreadable. The power dynamic had inverted so completely it felt as if gravity itself had reversed. The drawings, Captain, Ellie said, her voice soft but unforgiving. Pride, arrogance, and 15 years of unshakable self-importance warred within him. But fear won. Slowly, agonizingly, Captain Alistair Finch, the man who prided himself on his military bearing and impeccable appearance, knelt down on the cold, wet asphalt. The dirty water soaked through the knee of his perfectly pressed trousers. With shaking hands, he began to gather the ruined sketches. He picked up the main elevation, wiping the greasy water from its surface with the sleeve of his uniform, smearing the grime across the gold stripes he cherished so much. He stood up, holding the soggy bundle of paper like an offering. His head was bowed. Ms. Vance, I am profoundly sorry. A terrible, terrible misunderstanding. Ellie took the ruined plans from his hands. She didn't look at them. Lower the stairs, Captain. My grandmother is in the hospital. If I miss seeing her because of your ego, you will find out just how much a misunderstanding can cost. Finch scrambled to the side of the fuselage and hit the button to deploy the air stairs. The hydraulic whine sounded like a scream in the tense silence. As the stairs touched the ground, the main cabin door swung open. First Officer Ben Carter stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Vance," Ben said, his voice filled with a respect that bordered on reverence. "I have coffee and a warm blanket waiting for you." Ellie gave the young co-pilot a faint, appreciative nod. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." She walked up the stairs, her boots leaving damp footprints on the plush carpet. She brushed past Finch as if he were a ghost, a piece of invisible furniture. He followed her up, closing the heavy door behind them, his heart hammering against his ribs. He thought the apology, the groveling, had been enough. He thought he had saved himself. He was catastrophically wrong. The flight to Charleston was 1 hour and 47 minutes. It was 1 hour and 47 minutes for Ellie to sit in the silent, opulent cabin, staring at the back of his head through the open cockpit door, and meticulously draft the blueprint for his professional demolition. The Karma hadn't landed yet. It was still at its cruising altitude, preparing for a very steep descent. The interior of the Gulfstream G700 was a testament to Arthur Vance's understated taste: cream leather seats, dark walnut paneling, and brushed nickel fixtures. It was designed to be a calm oasis in the sky. But on this flight, at 43,000 feet, the silence was louder than a scream. Ellie sat in the forward-most seat, the one her grandfather had always preferred. She had shed her damp jacket, revealing a simple grey Henley underneath. A cashmere blanket, retrieved by the solicitous Ben Carter, was draped over her lap. A cup of steaming tea sat untouched on the polished wood ledge beside her. Her gaze was fixed on the flight-tracking map displayed on the bulkhead monitor, watching the tiny icon of their plane crawl southward over a menacing swirl of green and yellow weather radar. Every pixel of progress felt agonizingly slow. Her phone was useless this high up, the satellite Wi-Fi struggling to maintain a connection through the thick cloud layers below. She was suspended in a bubble of anxiety, cut off from the world, from the hospital, from any news of Clara. The only thing connecting her to her destination was the man in the cockpit, the man she now loathed with a cold, precise fury. In the cockpit, the tension was a physical presence. Captain Alastair Finch was flying the aircraft by hand, his grip on the yoke so tight his knuckles were white. He should have engaged the autopilot an hour ago, but he couldn't bring himself to relax. He felt Ellie's stare burning into the back of his neck. He was a man accustomed to command, to the easy deference of his crew and the admiration of his passengers. Now he was a chauffeur, a disgraced servant, flying under the watchful eye of his new silent master. Charleston approach, Gulfstream 901 Alpha Victor with you, flight level 240 descending, Finch said into his headset, his voice strained, trying to sound professional. Roger, Alpha Victor, expect vectors for the ILS runway 15. Weather at the field is light rain, winds 120 at 10 knots. Finch clicked his microphone twice in acknowledgement. He needed this landing to be flawless. He needed to set the G700 down on the Charleston runway as gently as a feather falling on silk. He needed to prove desperately that he was still the consummate professional, that the incident on the tarmac was an aberration, a momentary lapse. Perhaps a perfect flight could begin to undo the damage. Beside him, Ben Carter was a statue of nervous energy. He monitored the instruments, cross-checked the fuel consumption, and kept his comments to the bare minimum required by procedure. The hero worship he'd once felt for the veteran captain had evaporated, replaced by a mixture of fear and contempt. He had seen Finch's true character, and it was ugly. "She hasn't asked for anything," Finch muttered, unable to bear the silence any longer. "She's worried about her grandmother, Captain," Ben replied, his voice flat. "I know that," Finch snapped. "I'm not an idiot. Look, Carter, about what happened back there. You have to understand, we live in a different world now. Security is everything. You see someone dressed like that, on a secure ramp, you have to assume the worst. I was protecting the asset. I was protecting Mr. Vance's legacy." Ben turned his head to look at Finch, his young face unreadable. "You destroyed her property, sir, and you called her a vagrant." "It was a figure of speech." Finch's voice rose, bordering on frantic. "A misunderstanding. A bad one, I'll grant you. But it's fixable. People make mistakes. I'll apologize again when we land. I'll offer to pay for the drawings. I'll write a letter to her. A formal apology." Ben looked back out the windshield at the darkening clouds. "I don't think a letter is going to cover this, sir." The intercom chimed softly, making both pilots jump. "Mr. Carter," came Ellie's voice. It was calm, measured, and completely devoid of emotion. Ben fumbled for the talk button. "Yes, Miss Vance?" "There is a rattling sound coming from the forward galley, an upper cabinet latch. It's been vibrating since we hit turbulence over Virginia. Please have it noted for maintenance." "Of course, Miss Vance, right away." "Thank you. And Captain Finch?" Finch's heart leapt into his throat. Yes, Ms. Vance. What is our estimated time of arrival? He scrambled to check the flight management system. We are making excellent time, ma'am. I'm keeping our speed up. We should be on the ground in 22 minutes. I will get you there as quickly and safely as possible. 22 minutes, she repeated. The line clicked off. Finch let out a shaky breath. See? She's talking to me. It's professional. She's focused on the mission. Once she's with her grandmother, this whole thing will blow over. He was trying to convince himself more than Ben. His entire future hinged on her forgiveness, on her forgetting. He thought of his comfortable life in Greenwich, his son's tuition at Cornell, the boat he kept moored on the Sound. He wasn't just a pilot, he was Captain Alastair Finch, a man of substance. Losing this job wasn't just a career change, it was an annihilation of his identity. Back in the cabin, Ellie wasn't thinking about forgiveness. She was thinking about liability. The rattling latch wasn't just an annoyance, it was a data point. A small but significant piece of evidence. A captain as meticulous as Finch claimed to be, a man who supposedly revered Arthur Vance's standards, should have caught that on his pre-flight inspection. But he hadn't. His attention had been elsewhere. His focus had been on judging her, not on checking the aircraft. She opened her laptop. The Wi-Fi signal strengthened as they descended. She logged into the secure server for the Vance corporate holdings and pulled up the file for Apex Air Charter. She wasn't an MBA, she was an architect, but she understood structures, corporate structures as well as physical ones. She navigated through the operational handbooks, the HR policies, the crew employment contracts. She found Finch's file, 15 years of exemplary flight reviews, peppered with minor, heavily redacted notes about interpersonal friction with ground staff. She began to compose an email to Marcus Thorne. The subject line was simple: Incident Report and Safety Review, Flight N91AV. She didn't write an angry tirade, she wrote a structural analysis. She began with the facts of the tarmac encounter, listing them as bullet points, devoid of emotion. Then she moved on to her observations during the flight. Item 3. In-flight maintenance discrepancy. A faulty latch on galley cabinet G4 went unnoticed during pre-flight inspection. While minor, this oversight suggests Captain Finch's attention to detail may have been compromised prior to departure due to his fixation on a perceived security issue that was, in fact, the aircraft's owner. Item 4. Cockpit atmosphere. First Officer Carter has been subdued and has communicated only in monosyllables. This suggests a command environment that may not be conducive to open communication, a critical component of crew resource management, CRM, and overall flight safety. Conclusion: Captain Finch's behavior demonstrates a profound lack of judgment that extends beyond simple rudeness. His inability to assess a situation rationally, his willingness to escalate a simple identity check into a security incident, and his subsequent lack of procedural focus present a potential liability to the company and a risk to passenger safety. His personal prejudices are a structural flaw in his professionalism. Recommendation: immediate suspension, pending a full investigation into his conduct and a review of his flight history. Furthermore, I recommend a fleet-wide review of crew training protocols regarding passenger identification and de-escalation. She read it over twice. It was cold, clinical, and indefensible. It wasn't the letter of a hurt woman, it was the assessment of a concerned owner. She thought about his plea, his panicked apology. She thought about his family, his life. Then she thought about the next person he might encounter who didn't fit his narrow worldview. The next dark-skinned client, the next young female passenger, the next ground crew member with a foreign accent. An architect's first duty is to ensure the integrity of the foundation. Finch's foundation was rotten. She saved the email as a draft. She would not send it until she knew her grandmother was stable. First things first. The lights of Charleston appeared through the rain-streaked window, a welcoming constellation in the dark. The plane banked, lining up with the runway. Ellie braced herself. The landing was firm but smooth. Finch was, if nothing else, a technically skilled pilot. They taxied to the private terminal, the engines whining as they spooled down. Before the seatbelt sign was even extinguished, Ellie was on her feet, grabbing her jacket and the ruined portfolio. A black car was waiting on the ramp, its headlights cutting through the drizzle. Finch burst from the cockpit, his hat in his hand, his face a mask of desperate hope. Ben Carter followed, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. "Ms. Vance," Finch said, rushing to meet her at the door, "please allow me to express again my deepest, most sincere apologies. It was an inexcusable lapse. Ellie was already halfway down the stairs. She didn't break her stride. He hurried after her, his polished shoes splashing on the wet tarmac. He intercepted her just as the driver opened the rear door. The door of the sedan closed with a solid, definitive thud, sealing her in and shutting him out. For a moment, Ellie just sat in the plush leather silence, the scent of the car a sterile counterpoint to the damp, metallic smell of the rain still clinging to her clothes. She watched Captain Finch in the rearview mirror, a figure shrinking in the spreading glow of the taillights, his impeccable uniform now just a dark shape standing foolishly in the drizzle on a vast, empty expanse of concrete. He looked small, insignificant. The rage that had sustained her through the flight, a cold, hard diamond in her chest, began to dissolve, leaving behind an ache that was deeper and far more weary. In her lap, the portfolio felt heavy, sodden, like a drowned thing. She didn't open it. She didn't need to see the blurred ink and the greasy stains to know what had been lost. It wasn't just paper and watercolor, it was a conversation she was meant to have with her grandmother. A dialogue of light and space, a promise of future mornings spent watching the world awaken. Finch hadn't just shoved a folder, he had, in his blind arrogance, trampled on a prayer. The driver, a discreet man with kind eyes, navigated the service roads of the airport without a word. Ellie leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, the city lights of Charleston smearing into long, weeping streaks. She thought of her grandfather, Arthur Vance. He had been a titan of a man, not in stature, but in presence. He saw the world in terms of structure, of integrity. "A building with a flawed foundation, Ellie," he used to say, his voice a low rumble as they walked through a half-finished construction site, "is a lie waiting to collapse. It doesn't matter how beautiful the facade is, the truth is in the bones." Finch, with his polished shoes and his gold stripes, was a beautiful facade. But yesterday she had seen his foundation, and it was nothing but sand and spite, and her grandmother Clara. Clara's lessons were about the spaces between the bones. She taught Ellie about gardens, about how the strongest flowers were often the ones that had to fight through the hardest soil. "Strength isn't about being unbending, my love," Clara had told her once while pruning a rosebush with hands that were already beginning to tremble with age. "It's about knowing which way to grow to find the sun." Finch hadn't been looking for the sun. He had been content in his own small, self-made shadow, and he had tried to pull her into it with him. The thought brought not anger now, but a profound sadness. The car pulled up to the main entrance of the medical university. The air inside the hospital was a shock. Dry, warm and thick with the scent of antiseptic and something else, something less tangible, a low-grade humming anxiety. A kind-faced nurse met her in the cardiac wing, her voice a soft, southern lullaby of medical terminology. Stabilized. Clot retrieval was successful. Sedated but responsive to stimuli. Each phrase was a stepping stone across a chasm of fear. Clara was alive, she was fighting. The room was dim, dominated by the quiet tyranny of machines. Beep, hiss, beep. Clara was a small shape in the large bed, her vibrant, laughing face now pale and still, a network of tubes and wires tethering her to the living world. Ellie pulled a chair close, her movements slow and careful, as if a sudden noise might break the fragile peace. She reached out and took her grandmother's hand. It felt like a bird's wing, all delicate bone and paper-thin skin. Ellie sat for what felt like hours, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her grandmother's chest, the green line on the monitor that traced the stubborn, beautiful beating of her heart. She finally took out the ruined drawings. She carefully separated the damp pages, laying them out on the wide windowsill. The main elevation, the one that had landed in the puddle, was a mess. The crisp ink lines of the glass walls had bled into grey ghosts. The watercolor wash of the morning sky over the marsh, now a muddy bruise. But the form was still there. The idea. The love. She thought of Finch again, and realized with a start that her decision about him was not about punishment. It was about architecture. He was a faulty beam in the structure of the company her grandfather had built. A weak point that, under the right pressure, could cause a catastrophic failure. Leaving him in place would be a betrayal of everything Arthur Vance had stood for. It would be building a lie. Her phone buzzed, a jarring intrusion. She stepped into the sterile quiet of the hallway, the linoleum floor cool beneath her worn boots. It was Marcus Thorne. "She's stable," Ellie said immediately, her voice thick with unshed tears. A wave of genuine relief washed through the phone. "Oh, Ellie, that's the best news I've heard in a year." "Thank God." He paused, then his voice hardened. "Now, about our other problem. I've been making calls. Finch is a bigger liability than we knew. There's a pattern. 2 formal complaints filed by female ground crew at his last job for intimidating and derogatory language. Another incident in Aspen, an altercation with a baggage handler that the company quietly settled. The man is a walking lawsuit, a time bomb of arrogance. He's been hiding behind your grandfather's reputation for years." "I'm not surprised," Ellie said, her voice weary. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't a one-time error. It was a career built on bullying those he deemed beneath him. "I've grounded him and Carter," Marcus continued, his tone all business now. "They're to remain with the aircraft until a relief crew arrives tomorrow morning. I'm on the first flight down. I'll handle his termination personally. It needs to be done face-to-face, by the book." "You want me there?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Absolutely not," Marcus said, his voice softening again. "You don't need to see that. You stay with Clara. That's the only thing that matters. I'll take care of the trash." Ellie looked through the small wired glass window in the door at the sleeping woman who had taught her to face things head-on. To weed the garden, not just ignore the thorns. "No," she said, her voice finding a new, quiet strength. "I'll be there. It's my company. My responsibility. The foundation is my responsibility." There was a moment of silence on the line, and then Marcus said with a note of deep respect, "All right, Ellie, I'll see you at the FBO at dawn." Dawn broke over Charleston Harbor in strokes of bruised purple and pale watery gold. At a generic hotel near the airport, Alistair Finch knotted his tie with hands that were almost steady. He had spent the night wrestling with the ghosts of his own making, but his ego was a formidable opponent. By the time the sun rose, he had successfully recast the entire drama. He was not the villain, he was the victim of a hysterical, overtired young woman on a power trip. A girl playing dress-up in her grandfather's company. Thorne was panicking, but he would come to his senses. A pilot of Finch's caliber, with his unblemished 15-year record flying for the legendary Arthur Vance, was an asset, not a liability. This would all be smoothed over with a formal apology. One he was already composing in his head, full of magnanimous phrases and carefully calibrated contrition. He put on his uniform jacket, the 4 gold stripes on his shoulders a reassuring weight. They were his armor, his identity. He arrived at the executive terminal to find Ben Carter in the cockpit, quietly going through the pre-flight checks. The young man looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn. "Morning, Carter," Finch boomed with a confidence he didn't feel. "Let's get this bird buttoned up. Thorne's making a mountain out of a molehill. We'll be back in Westchester by noon, and this will all be forgotten." Ben didn't look up from the checklist. "Mr. Thorne's instructions were to wait for the relief crew, Captain." "Nonsense," Finch scoffed, settling into the left-hand seat, the familiar worn leather a comfort to him. He was emotional. Once he's had his coffee, he'll realize how ridiculous this is. "In our world, Carter, competence is currency, and we are nothing if not competent." As if on cue, the high-pitched whine of another jet's engines cut through the morning calm. A sleek Learjet, emblazoned with the Apex Air Charter logo, touched down and taxied across the ramp, coming to a stop 100 feet from their Gulfstream. It was a predator approaching its prey. "Well now," Finch muttered, a knot of ice forming in his stomach. "Thorne is certainly putting on a show." The Learjet's air stairs lowered. First, Marcus Thorne emerged, his tall frame silhouetted against the rising sun, his face a thundercloud. And then, right behind him, came Eleanor Vance. She was dressed simply in dark trousers and a grey sweater, but she moved with an authority that made his uniform feel like a costume. They walked across the tarmac, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space between the jets, their shadows long and purposeful. "Oh my God," Ben whispered from the co-pilot's seat. The fortress of Finch's denial crumbled to dust. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice a dry croak. "I'll handle this." He scrambled from his seat, his heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. He met them at the bottom of the G700 stairs, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass on his lips. "Mr. Thorne, Ms. Vance, a pleasure to see you. I trust you had a good flight. As I was saying, this entire situation has been a profound misunderstanding for which I take complete and utter responsibility." Marcus Thorne walked past him as if he were invisible, his gaze fixed on the cockpit. "Carter, get your flight bag and your personal effects. You're flying back with us." Ben's face appeared in the window, gave a single solemn nod, and vanished. Thorne finally turned, his eyes as cold and hard as granite. "Alistair Finch, your employment with Apex Air Charter and all associated Vance Holdings is terminated, effective immediately. For cause." The phrase hung in the humid air, sucking the oxygen from his lungs. "For cause," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. "For a simple misunderstanding. You can't be serious. That's a gross overreaction." "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Captain," Ellie said. Her voice was quiet, without a trace of the anger from the day before. "It was something far worse. It was pitying. It was an audit. You see, my grandfather taught me that the most important part of any structure is the integrity of its materials. You look for stress fractures, for weak points, for signs of rot. Yesterday, you showed me a fatal flaw in your character, and it turns out it's a pattern." Thorne opened a thin file he was carrying. "We have sworn statements from 3 former colleagues detailing a history of verbal harassment and intimidation. We have the full, unedited audio from the cockpit voice recorder of your interaction with Ms. Vance yesterday. And we have a formal safety review, filed by me, citing your gross negligence during the pre-flight inspection, a deficiency first noted by the aircraft's owner." He gestured with his chin towards the gleaming Gulf Stream. "This is no longer your aircraft to command. Your credentials have been revoked. Your security clearances have been rescinded. Remove your epaulets and your company identification and hand them to me." The final, unthinkable humiliation, the stripping of his rank. It was happening. Not in an office, but here, on the tarmac, in the shadow of the machine that had been his kingdom. His face burned with a hot, helpless rage. "You can't," he hissed, his voice trembling. "I'll fight this. I'll go to the union, the FAA. I'll tell them this company is run by an unstable, vindictive child who fires loyal employees on a whim." "You tell them whatever you need to," Thorne said, his voice flat. "We have the documentation. You are a liability we can no longer afford. Now, the stripes." With hands that shook so badly he could barely unfasten the buttons, Finch slid the stiff boards from his shoulders. The 4 gold bars, the symbols of his entire adult life, felt weightless and worthless in his palm. He handed them over, along with his ID badge. Thorne took them and dropped them into the file without a glance, as if handling contaminated material. Just then, Ben Carter descended the stairs carrying his flight bag. He looked at Finch, his expression not of triumph, but of deep, uncomfortable sorrow, and walked over to stand beside Ellie and Thorne. "Ben," Ellie said, and her voice was warm again, a stark contrast to the ice she had shown Finch. "Your conduct yesterday, under extremely difficult circumstances, was exemplary. You demonstrated a commitment to procedure and a calm professionalism that is the hallmark of a true command pilot." She looked at Thorne. "Marcus, I am promoting Mr. Carter to the rank of captain, effective immediately. He will take command of 901 Alpha Victor for the return flight to Westchester with the new first officer." Thorne allowed a small, grim smile. "As the owner wishes. Congratulations, Captain Carter." Ben stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from Ellie's steady gaze to the disgraced man who had been his mentor, and back again. The entire world had just tilted on its axis. "Ms. Vance, thank you. Thank you, ma'am." It was the final perfect crushing blow. Finch stood there, stripped of his rank, his career, his identity, forced to witness his own subordinate being elevated to his stolen throne. It was not just a firing, it was an erasure. "So," he finally managed to say, his voice a ragged whisper, "how am I supposed to get home?" Ellie looked at him one last time. There was no victory in her eyes, only a quiet finality. "There is a Delta flight to LaGuardia departing from the main terminal at 11:45, she said, her tone informational, as if giving directions to a stranger. "If you hurry, you might just make it. I imagine they'll have a middle seat available for you in coach." She turned, and together with Thorne and the new Captain Carter, she walked toward the waiting Learjet, not once looking back. Alistair Finch was left alone on the tarmac, a ghost in a pilot's suit. He was no longer a captain. He was just a man facing the long, humbling walk to the public terminal, a world of crowds and lines and indignities he hadn't known for 25 years. Back in the quiet of Clara's hospital room, the morning sun was now streaming through the window bright and warm. Ellie took the ruined drawing of the sunroom, the one that had survived its baptism of filth, and carefully taped it to the glass. The light poured through the paper, illuminating the faint lines of the glass walls, the ghost of the marsh beyond, making the dream of the room come alive. From the bed there was a soft rustle of sheets. Ellie turned. Her grandmother's eyes were open, just slits at first, but they were open. They fixed on the drawing taped to the window, on the sunlight filtering through it. A slow, faint smile touched Clara's lips. Ellie rushed to the bedside and took her grandmother's hand. It was still frail, but there was the faintest pressure in return, a flicker of the strength that had always been there. The storm had passed. She had defended the foundations, she had weeded the garden, and now, here in the quiet light, she could finally feel the sun.